Oh wow, those lights are telling me that we are on, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Do find your way to your seat if you can. That'd be awesome. I hope everyone enjoyed the networking lunch and made the valuable connections that we like to see in our Green Cities community. It is now with considerable pleasure that I introduce our next session, Winning Hearts and Minds. I've been listening to Clever Clog's Tim Gartrell ever since, as a wonderkind ALP Federal Secretary, he addressed a Property Council team retreat in Canberra 15 years ago, the week that Simon Crean got rolled. Happy times. And I can say from first-hand experience that Tim knows how to build coalitions around challenging issues. He's the mastermind behind some of Australia's most groundbreaking campaigns, including the Yes Marriage Equality movement, recognised on behalf of Reconciliation Australia, and the Australian Labor Party's Kevin 07 election campaign. Quiet in the front, Romilly. Tim joins us today to explore the tactics needed to sell the sustainability story, better engage with our clients and customers, and ultimately to energise our communities. And I note we've only got time for about 3 questions at the end, so I'm going to go to mics as a preference, and people who haven't already rocked a mic as a preference. Not saying anything, Oricon, just there. And on that note, please give a very warm welcome to our honoured afternoon guest, the terrific Tim Gartrell.
Thanks, Michael. Welcome back after lunch. Now, just to let you know, there's been a slight change. Romilly's been looking at events overnight, so I'm going to start this speech at about 3 minutes in. I'm going to get sacked, and she's going to bring Mike Zorbas in and move me into something else, and then she's going to say during that I'm a great guy. He was a great guy. We just didn't agree on some things. Didn't like his speech. We moved someone else on, and then Mike will get sacked halfway through his speech, and we'll pull someone else up, and it'll keep going like that. That's how you lead the world these days, folks. I just want to thank you for having me here today, and to also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation whose land we're meeting on, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of so many people and companies in this room during the marriage equality campaign. I don't want that to go past, because I know there was huge support across the Australian community, all sorts of organisations, including businesses and companies, all sorts of people. So thank you. But I do want to particularly do a shout out to International Towers Sydney and Lend-Lease people. If you're here, is Liam Tim here? Is Liam here? Where is he? Over here. So very good example of how you can empower communities and work with people is provide some space for them when they're running a very large national campaign or a postal survey, because that's what the guys at International Towers did. And I can tell you, working for 3 months solidly, night and day, in a really beautiful, lovely green building, actually does make a difference when you're doing a campaign, because you're never working in a building like that, I can tell you. So thank you, Liam, and thanks to your team. Now on to winning hearts and minds. When we did the masterclass yesterday, there was a typo in one of the bits of material that went out. It's called whining hearts and minds, which could be a really good way to do it, but we'd probably get in trouble. But I've been doing campaigning for 3 decades, really all my adult life. I grew up in country New South Wales. Like a lot of people who grow up in country areas, as soon as I possibly could, I got to the big smoke, went to Sydney and threw myself into campaigning, because I really had always enjoyed that. And it was 1989, it was the tail end of the anti-apartheid movement worldwide, and so I volunteered quite naively. I was 18 at the time. Someone said, "Oh, go to this place called White City and hand out flyers about the tennis players who are playing in South Africa." I thought, "Oh yeah, I'll go and do that." So anyway, it's amazing what an afternoon of being told to piss off and mind your own business can do for you. I even got the bird flipped from Wally Masseur. His car came through and he actually stopped, and the power window went down, and I got the bird. So that did teach me that just because you believe in something doesn't always mean the other person believes in it as well. A good early lesson. So my career then wove its way through campaigns in the early 90s and then into the ALP national headquarters for the 1998 GST campaign, which was a very close shave for the then first-term Howard government. Then a few elections later, I worked my way to become the National Campaign Director, and they gave me my first task, which was to sell Mark Latham to the Australian community. Some men voted for him. A lot of women didn't vote for him. He's never forgotten that, and neither have I. And it turns out, in a way, the public sometimes got a pretty good radar for these things. Then, after all of that and the strife that came after that election, we then moved towards the 2000 campaign, which was a completely different scenario. And that's where we started to really apply what I call highly resonant frames, and I'll come back to the term frames later, but future versus past, new versus old, dealing with climate change versus denying it, being on the side of middle-class families, and that actually saw one of the biggest swings in Australia's history. But 10 years later, late last year, the Campaign for Marriage Equality comes along and brought home its historic result on the back of a well-embedded Australian narratives of fairness, equality and empathy for the people we know, people in our families, people in our communities, people in our workplaces. So connecting very directly with people's real experiences. All of these big national campaigns come with very highly complicated propositions. You'll see currently today with the debate around superannuation and tax and who's taxed and who's not, how complicated these things are. This is not easy stuff. Detailed policies, pages of costings, lengthy analysis. But every winning campaign connects with the hearts more than it connects with the minds. And how does that happen? Well, it's actually all happening in the mind, even though it's more emotional than it is rational, and I'll explain how that works. We've all learned that earnestly taking a bunch of facts and figures and showering people with them does not always work. It's one of the great frustrations for highly educated, highly technically trained people. It's so apparent to you and it doesn't work. And usually we know when it's not working because we're using phrases like, what you need to understand is, or look, can't you see, the facts are, bang, bang, bang. And nothing demonstrates this more than debates around climate change and now renewable energy. It remains a complete puzzle to some of the most highly intelligent people on the planet that the facts and figures that are so clear to them have not converted all earthlings to the cause of reducing our emissions and stopping dangerous global warming. I've even heard of one eminent scientist who considered quitting his job and going back to do a psychology degree to just understand how people could be so immune to the facts. Now, around the same time that all this stuff was going on, the controversy about climate was starting to build, the contestability about climate. The US Democrats were searching their souls about how John Kerry lost the 2004 election when a bunch of working class Americans voted against their interests and re-elected George W. Bush, who was promising some of the most generous tax cuts, but for wealthy individuals. And it's around this time that the cognitive researchers and the linguists started to work together and draw together years of work, stuff that's been around since the 70s, about how people received and interpreted facts and figures. Why was it that when presented with evidence, people remained divided, even when it was the result, as we know with climate, of overwhelming scientific belief? What was revealed was that the existing narratives, stories which form the values or belief structures in our brains are far more important in determining opinions than new data or statistics. In fact, these narratives, sometimes called frames, these narratives, these metaphors, they're the lens through which we interpret the world. It's how we learn when we're children. It's hardwired. They're physical structures in our brains. They are neural pathways that have been formed and then reinforced and reinforced over time. This then was applied to politics by a linguist called George Lakoff, who in 2004 wrote a groundbreaking book, Don't Think of an Elephant. Of course, the minute I've said that, most of you will have actually thought of an elephant. That's because the elephant exists in your mind as part of your brain. It's firmly implanted. It's an existing idea or frame. You apply this to the language of the Republican policy at the time, Republican Party policy of tax relief, so think of the word relief, even it was only for the very top part of the tax bracket, and then Democrats who were opposing it were positioned as against relief because they used the language that had been very cleverly thought up by the Republicans. So they were against tax relief. Going back to these frames that already exist, you can see there will be a big difference in the way one person reacts to new information compared to another. Take climate change. One person sees evidence of rising temperatures as a sign of the climate change they believe is man-made. Another interprets that evidence as part of a natural long-term fluctuations in global temperatures. We see this debate going on all the time. We see it, I know it with friends of mine, particularly friends of mine who are over 50. They firmly believe this is all part of long-term natural trends. So for one person, the data spurs them into action, to advocate for measures to reduce our carbon footprint and to act, like many of you in this room have done through all your good work. But for another, it comes in through the frame that this is just a natural process, it's part of the Earth's rhythms, and therefore the data must be some sort of conspiracy between scientists who are being brainwashed by green left ideologues and other left scientists, or sadly more recently this term fake news, which is a real way to just let people go with the frame of mind that they originally have and reject new information. In these scenarios, the only view that the two people share is the disbelief that the other could possibly hold the opposing view. And of course, what's complicated things since 2004, when this work was written up, is that we're seeing a complete revolution in how these ideas are communicated and who they're communicated to. With the advent of social media, the decline of legacy media such as newspapers, the rise of digital news media, which is very self-selecting. You're either selecting the media that you like because it reinforces your opinion, or the algorithms are serving you up the media based on what you searched before. So very selective. We're seeing more and more cleaving of media usage along ideological lines and echo chambers that are forcing many with opposing views even further apart and with even less understanding and empathy for each other. So what does that mean for us? And when I say us, I mean people who are trying to unite the public around a common goal, whether it be, in the case of my former roles, someone trying to get a majority government elected that represents just more than a political base, because no political party's got a base bigger than a third these days, or winning the nation over to support marriage rights for all people, or those of you who are trying to garner broad support for high levels of sustainability in the built environment. In short, it's made our job a whole lot harder. It means today we have to juggle the difficult task of building those strong and coherent narratives, the ones that resonate with the frames and narratives in people's minds, but we also need to be mindful that we're going to have to play it out in different channels with different audiences because the audiences have become so fragmented. More than 10 years ago, in the 2007 election, when smartphones were adolescents, Facebook was a child and Twitter was barely an infant, this was done by building overarching frames, future versus past, old versus new, all the ones I mentioned before, and then we rolled them out pretty much in the way everyone's done it since in the post-war era, using television, using radio. There was some new digital stuff around, which was what the Kevin 07 stuff was tapping into, but it was only 10 years ago that it was still mostly done the way it had always been done. But 10 years later, and the campaign to secure the historic yes vote in the postal survey was run in a way that was nearly inconceivable in 2007, mostly thanks to change in campaign technology. 10 years ago, it would have been inconceivable to build an army of 15,400 volunteers within a matter of 8 weeks and deploy them to have direct conversations with over 1 million voters. 10 years ago, raising more than $1.2 million, mostly from people who hadn't made political donations in the past, solely via digital platforms, again within 8 weeks, would not have been achievable. And 10 years ago, the ability to sit down every day and recut the target voter profile and serve people up new messages, new videos, new ads, and even new billboards, which were always the bane of campaigners' existence, having to take down old billboards, put new ones up. Most of them are digital now, so within 24 hours, you've retweaked your narrative, your messages very quickly to your new target market, depending what's happening. So what do we make of all of this? First, persuading people with language and stories they understand, they know, and that matches their framing and their value systems is as important or more important than it's ever been, because it's such a cluttered world. So these stories, narratives, frames and metaphors are still real structures that exist in our brains. Despite the technology, the human brain is still configured in the same way it's always been. And secondly, although the ways we receive our media and the platform the media is served up to us has changed, we now have the tools to build our own channels, to measure the impact of our messages and our ideas in real time and persuade people to our causes. So we go around the media, and in a negative way, as far as I'm concerned, that's what the now President Trump did, was go around the media using social media. Now, a big hint here is for you older folk like me, be nice to the clever young people around, so you can stop the bagging about smashed avocado and millennials and all the rest. They actually know these platforms really well because they're using them all the time and they know how to do this stuff. And in the marriage equality campaign, they're an incredible asset for us and fantastic young people. But going back, language, values and how you frame your arguments is still the foundation of any successful campaign. In order to do this, we must make sure that the technical jargon, buzzwords, acronyms that build up and stick to us like the chewing gum on the footpath you can never get off your shoe, we've got to make sure that these do not get in the way of telling powerful stories that can energise people and transform their lives. We know that language, framing, metaphors, stories are the key to persuading people and spurring them into action, so we must be vigilant about the diluting power of our jargon. I'm concerned, and this came through in the masterclass we did yesterday, which was a really good experience, and thanks to the people who came. We were concerned there that the term sustainability has become overused, misused, abused, and has lost much of the power of its original meaning. And this is partly because the efforts of you in this room have been so successful. Sustainability in the built environment is now being endorsed by powerful interests who wouldn't have opposed you not so long ago. I can think of no better sign of this success than the Green Star rating. It's a huge credit to all of you in this room, the huge number of people who have been working on this for a long time. A huge credit to the Green Building Council team, huge credit to Romilly and the team. It's fantastic. So you've taken something that's been a complex proposition, you've made it common sense and good business. So you've actually done what I'm saying up till now, which is you've used the narratives and frames that people needed to hear, particularly in business, and you won them over. But there's still so much more to do, and the challenges keep mounting. We've got to get to the point in our masterclass, someone said, we've got to get to the point where, people buying an apartment aren't going in and asking for the marble benchtop and the plasma screen TV. They're actually asking for the sustainable features. They're asking about the energy usage. They're asking about the glazing and all the rest. They're asking where the material's coming from, what's the waste stream like. They're actually asking that. We're not pushing that on them. So this conference is timely, and it's time to take stock and reassess the power of the term sustainability. I thought I'd better test this thesis out because I always argue that you should plan and test very strongly before you leap into a campaign. So I asked some of the researchers that I know who are doing focus group work all the time in the Australian community, some of the really good ones who really know their stuff, and I asked them to think about this word sustainability and what it means to the public generally, and the consensus was pretty much what your gut would tell you. People are supportive, people are roughly positive, but this is directly from some of the emails I got back. Consumers feel dazed and confused about the complex and seemingly contradictory information about environmental products and behaviour. People are becoming more wary of claims due to greenwashing in supermarket products, the use of the terms recyclable, this sort of stuff. People are starting to see through some of this. Cost is still seen as a factor. It's also muddied by the false claims and some of the scepticisms that are around it as environmental measures are becoming more contestable. This is a flow through of the climate change debate where it's become, there is licence now to contest some of the basic assumptions. And people believe government and big business still need to do more. They feel they're doing their bit with the household recycling and other measures. They want more incentives from government for them to be able to do that themselves. And they want big business to do their bit. All the researchers I spoke to, interestingly, agreed that the idea of sustainability is starting to become, in one person's words, overstretched or overused, losing its currency, and it can't be assumed people know exactly what it means, particularly in any detail. So it seems to me one of the first challenges is to reclaim the original cut-through of the concept, sustainability, and to align it with the narratives and frames and values of the audience we're seeking to empower. How could we possibly empower communities, empower people around an idea, when the main descriptor is being leached of its meaning? We need to take stock, take that extra time, spend the extra resources and connect with language that resonates and energises people and energises their communities. And we talk about all the early success with the Green Star ratings, but also think of some of the common language that was used early on: reduce, reuse, recycle, think globally, act locally. Some of these things need to be rethought. Once that's been done, then the task of empowering people and their communities becomes more a matter of your strategy, your tactics, logistics, hard slog, and some clever use of the new technologies. And with a message that's more closely aligned to the values of the community, the new digital platforms can be used to great effect. For example, social media can be a powerful tool for building a community around a compelling idea, when led by advocates from that community. I was talking to someone from one of the health unions, one of the nurses' unions, saying they're now letting go of some of their social media and letting their local hospital members do a lot of commenting on their local social media, and it's building a lot of information sharing and camaraderie at that local level. So I know it's a scary world with Facebook controlling and all the rest, but it is good to be able to have people let go and run their agendas in their local community. It can be a great place for people to get organised. Community members or supporters can be sought out and targeted too, with the great targeting techniques that can be utilised in this technology and brought into the online platform. So it becomes a means to an end, not an end in itself. If there's a larger audience to be persuaded, and I think there is, I think that the industry needs to keep ahead of Australian public opinion. I worry about the renewable sector losing ground with Australian public opinion. Then social media can be used to drive compelling messages to strike an emotional chord and resonate with people's real experiences and increasing their voices. So real experiences in the marriage equality campaign was, rather than talking to people about rights and human rights, we actually had a series of interviews with people about their lives, about the loves in their lives, remarkable stories of love and commitment served up to people. And the array of new platforms goes on. There's probably one being launched as I speak. But I want to end on this note. In the midst of all the noise about new devices, big data, social media and the rest, let's not forget the power of well-researched, well-framed arguments that connect with the values of our audience and the language and narratives they use to interpret the world. Let's push ahead to the next phase in the struggle for a better environment, better cities, and a better life with ideas and language that, rather than creating distance and disconnection, creates energy and reconnects the ideals of sustainability with people's values and their communities. That sounds like empowerment to me. Thank you. Look forward to some questions.
Great job. Thank you, Tim. Well, that is a challenge about the size of Mick Dundee's knife. So I feel quite bad. I feel like we're committing a crime against the spirit of human inquiry to say that there's only time for 2 questions.
Sorry about that.
And no, but that's, I think, because of the density of the material and in fact the flavour-packed explosion of this statement that says, you know, we've got a bit of rethinking to do as an industry. It's always nice to be confronted in your own peaceful, quiet, tranquil realm, isn't it? So, do I have any questions from the floor? I mean, you must have some questions of a master campaigner. You, sir, handsome there with the microphone. Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Zorbas. Mark, thank you for that insightful presentation and congratulations on the Yes campaign. Also, one of the other aspects about the Yes campaign was the quiet, committed support of many corporates around the place. Some were more vocal, but a lot were behind the radar, very supportive. So that's perhaps a lead into this question, which is, what are the lessons we can learn from the Yes campaign in trying to persuade our leaders? We had in this very room this morning Mark Butler and Josh Frydenberg, who are leading debate on a particular area, but they won't speak about, well, Mark did, carbon pricing. Josh won't. Why have our politicians turned off? There was a time when they used to campaign for the community support. Now it seems that the community's got to campaign to them to get their message across. So what is your advice, given the success of the Yes campaign, about how our industry can influence our political leaders to actually see what the rest of us are seeing?
Yeah, it's definitely been a sea change, hasn't there? And I think partly it's because being in opposition has become easy. It's easy to knock someone off, particularly with social media, with negativity and opposition. So that's the path people have headed down. I don't think it's going to change quickly. The need to sort of drag political leaders to positions more these days. I think what we take from the marriage equality campaign, see, everyone saw the very last bit of it, and I was brought in for the last bit, the postal survey. But there'd been people who've been working on that for a decade. There were 22 attempts to change the law in the Parliament, 22 pieces of legislation before they finally got there. So you've got to be really persistent, you've got to keep at it, but I really strongly advocate for building your own channels, building your own movement to an extent, and getting these messages out and getting ahead of the game with public opinion, because unfortunately things have got very reactive with politicians. I knew marriage equality was going all right when one politician said to me, we've got to get it done, they're just so annoying, and there's just so many people coming up to me and saying we've got to get this done, I just want to get it out of the way. So it's a different mindset to the old days, which is, I have this idea, let's go for it, I'll bring everyone with me. So I'd be advocating, build up the channels, build up the audiences, the technology's there to do it. You don't have to be overtly nasty, sharp, political. Marriage equality was good at trying to keep it out of partisan politics, but I think you need to go to Canberra with a very large army of support behind you these days.
38 seconds to go. I'm going to indulge myself. I can only assume that everybody wants the people's favourite inquisitor to ask another question because they've left it to Jeff.
Awesome presentation. Thank you so much. One of the things that I'm pretty passionate about is lifting building standards. And I love the idea of telling stories. And I have this idea of a young couple in a house. They've just bought it, two beautiful children, cuddly dog, £10 notes or dollar notes sailing out through the walls where the building is leaking. How do I turn
frustrated advertising creative, mate? I can tell that.
How do I turn some of those stories in, or those kind of things, to get a grassroots campaign going that actually push the politicians to say this is something important to me?
Well, you're on the right track. You're on the right track to start with, and my business partner's a creative for 30 years, so he'd be smiling. It's always good to get some creative ideas from the floor. But you're approaching in the right way, which is, the wrong way is always, we need to tell people that the building code contains 5 points which could, after blah, 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 and you're gone. Just the way you're doing it with a young couple actually telling their story, right? That is the great way to start. And it's so easy to capture that on video these days, inexpensively. The costs of production have plummeted because of the technology and the editing, and so you can get that done really quickly. That's going to resonate and get through to young people who are also in that situation. So it's a perfect example of going through their frame, not going through yours.
Wonderful. Please join with me in thanking Tim for sharing his great insights. Glad to see you. Before we commence our next session, it gives me great pleasure to welcome back onto the stage Mr. Ken Morrison, Chief Executive of the Property Council, to make a special announcement regarding how we're creating jobs and strong communities together. Please join with me.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks very much, Tim, for a very insightful presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, the property industry is acutely aware of some of the issues that Tim has just flagged for us this afternoon. It's very important for the industry to understand what its brand is in the community, both the positive attributes of its brand and its brand weaknesses. And that's certainly important for this industry, one that touches the lives of all Australians and plays such an important role in the public policy debates within this country. Last month, the Property Council launched a new industry campaign, Creating for Generations. I might just bring the slides up, please. The purpose of the campaign is to showcase the proud story of our industry. It's an industry that is Australia's largest employer, employing more people than mining and manufacturing combined. It's an industry that creates prosperity, jobs and strong communities, and together we shape the very future of our cities. It's a message that the industry got in behind. In addition to the TV, radio, outdoor and digital campaign run by the Property Council, we've also seen these messages in shopping centres, in office buildings, display homes, in the inboxes of those working in the industry. So thank you very much for everybody in the room who've provided your support for this campaign. It's also a message we've been bringing home to political leaders. Individual electorate fact sheets detail the jobs this industry creates right across the country, facts that every politician in the country now also knows. So for those of you who might have missed it, let's look at the TV ad.
Together we create jobs for over 1.4 million people. That's more than mining and manufacturing combined, making us Australia's biggest employer. Together we're creating homes and communities and shaping our cities for the future. We are the Australian property industry, and together we're creating, planning and building for generations.
Ta-da. What was I doing back there? Who knows? I was lost in a dream, a beautiful dream. It seemed like there was propaganda on the screen. I hope you all enjoyed that. It is an excellent video, Ken. I am now delighted to introduce our next session, The Renting Revolution, Do Developers Make Good Landlords? Please welcome to the stage our moderator, someone who himself is deeply passionate about property, the wonderful Nick Lenehan, journalist at the Australian Financial Review.
Thanks, Mike. Yep. Thanks very much, Mike. Yeah, that's a great segue to come in on from the property industry ad there. And I have to make my excuses. I'm just a humble newspaper journalist, unused to the spotlight, but I'm quite excited about this next topic. And as ironically, last night I was actually typing up an interview furiously late at night, interview with an American fund manager, and I was asking about their allocations in their portfolio, and he was going through it. And as he was going through, he just mentioned, 25% apartments. So I went back and I said, hang on, when you say apartments, do you mean this is residential development that you're doing? And he said, no, they're multi-family, so we own them, we hold them, and we rent them out. And it just gave me pause to think, gee, that really is the difference between offshore markets and what we've got here, which is not really a build-to-rent market at all. So it's a great panel that we'll have. And I'd like to introduce first Adam Hurst, General Manager for Capital Allocation at Mirvac. So let's give Adam a boost. Thanks, Adam. And next up is Tony Millis from Lendlease. She's a Group Executive there. So thanks very much, Tony. And last back is the incomparable Ken Morrison back on stage. And Ken, I think, is going to give us a bit of an overview for the rent-to-build sector. Sorry, build-to-rent sector. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So I've been asked to give a really quick overview of where we sit from a public policy perspective as a bit of a starter to this session. So build-to-rent is the creation of new specialist residential property owned by a single institutional owner, created for lease and not for sale. So what are the public policy benefits of build to rent? Broadly, I'm sure we'll go into it in much more details, but broadly, a better quality experience for people who rent. Secondly, more choice and diversity in the market, as well as more housing supply, which we so desperately need. And thirdly, there's the opportunity for governments to partner with a thriving build-to-rent sector to incentivise the provision of affordable rental housing, and no doubt we'll talk about that a bit more in the panel as well. So these are big benefits, but we don't have build-to-rent in Australia in any real form. Lots of other countries do. Some have had build-to-rent for many decades, but probably the best example for us to look at a jurisdiction which has facilitated the establishment of build-to-rent in more recent years has been the UK. And the UK, in the midst of the global financial crisis, decided it wanted to foster this new asset class. And they did it because they recognised three things. One, that it would be great for tenants. Secondly, it would add to housing supply, which was a huge issue in that country at that time. And they recognised the potential also to get more affordable rental housing stock off the back of a thriving at-market sector. So they commissioned a major report into the issue, the Montague report. I really recommend for those of you who are very interested in this space that you pick it up and have a look at it. The aim of that was really to understand the benefits, but also the disbenefits, some of the blockages, and what would be the things that government in that country would need to do to help facilitate the emergence of build to rent. It certainly found very, very big benefits. It also set out a roadmap, and very interestingly, that roadmap had a bunch of quite hard policy initiatives as part of, but also some soft policy initiatives. So one of the things which we don't need in Australia, but at the time in the GFC in the UK they felt they did, was a capital investment fund to invest directly in build to rent. So you can't get more active than that. But also they brought some people in the private sector into government to help work with local government, to help work with the valuation community, help work with the industry on what was required to support build to rent. And that stuck. Last year the May government released its housing white paper, and build to rent was a key component of that, about delivering diversity and about delivering supply and a better quality rental experience in the UK. So where are we here? Well, we have lukewarm support from the federal government, and probably lukewarm at best. Last year they released draft legislation for managed investment trusts, which is the vehicle that institutional investment in real estate occurs through. And the effect of that draft legislation would have been to ban build to rent from using an MIT, which effectively meant banning build to rent at any scale in Australia. That legislation was never tabled, thankfully. The government's still determining what it intends to do with that legislation, but the public comments that we've heard out of government haven't been particularly encouraging. So no doubt we'll come back to that a little bit later as well. On the flip side, we've had some very encouraging feedback and discussions with state government, particularly the Victorian and New South Wales governments led by their treasurers, both of which have understood the benefits. They've both been engaging very closely with industry, and they're both right now taking public policy packages through their government. So, we're quite hopeful of some good supportive news there. So Nick, there you have it. At this stage, we don't have any public policy framework at all, a mixture of positive sentiment and negative sentiment.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ken. Do I need a microphone? Okay. Thanks, Ken. I think we need to really dive into that a bit more. The whole state-federal thing is a bit of an issue. But perhaps we should open it up on a more positive note, both from the Lend-Lease perspective and from Mirvac. And I guess, as we all would be, sort of curious as to how you're approaching the sector, the nascent sector, and how you're viewing it. And you both have sort of a bit of experience in the sector already. So perhaps, Tony, should I bring you in first, sorry, and talk about, how Lendlease is seeing the sector here and overseas.
So, thank you. Thanks, Nick. So Lendlease, I think, is very, very interested in the sector in Australia, and really off the back of what we're doing internationally. So we have just entered into a partnership in the UK with CPPIB, where we're going to develop, build and own and manage what's called build to rent, PRS. There's so many names for this sector, multifamily, so you'll hear lots of different terms. So we've just entered into that partnership. We're going to deliver the first 600 or 700 units with a view to growing that in the US, where multifamily is already a significant sector. It's the second largest real estate sector in the US. We're already in the process of delivering or developing a number of apartment units, and we're looking for partners. We see the Australian market really ripe for the product. So why do we say that? I think the demographics are shifting. We know affordability is becoming an issue. We know we've had population growth. Looking at the number of renters in the market, there's been a significant increase. So, roughly 30% of the market rents, but when you get to the inner areas, it can get up to 60 or 70%. The renter experience is not great. So there's been a lot of research, and no doubt many of you have read it, and many people who rent would have experienced it, as I have. So we think there's a real opportunity for this asset class in Australia, subject to certain things happening. So
yeah. Oh, that's a great...
We're very interested.
Yeah. I think we should come back to that idea of the rental experience, because that probably speaks to some of the themes of the conference, energising communities and the kind of community that comes into one of these projects. But Adam, did you want to share how Mirvac's looking at the sector here in Australia?
Yeah, sure. It's been widely reported about how Mirvac's looking to go into this space. We're out in the market with an institutional club at the moment, but I think it's worth stepping back to when we first started looking at this space and why we got such conviction for it in Australia. And it really came down to answering 3 questions. Is there a major customer problem, and what is that problem? If we solve that problem, is it scalable, and is it going to have a big impact? And then thirdly, is Mirvac set up, and do we have a competitive advantage to go into that space? The customer piece, Tony touched on it, and we did a lot of work up front talking to our customers, talking to renters, understanding their frustrations with the current model. And what became clear that there definitely is a customer problem, and it really centres on choice, security of tenure, and that service quality, which I'm sure we'll get into after. The second bit was then, all right, we've identified a problem. How big a problem is it? Is it scalable? Again, it's the most recent census came out. Renting is on the rise. It's rising far quicker in Australia than the formation of owner-occupier housing. And you only have to look at the US, the take-up in the UK, to see how large and institutional this sector can be if it's done successfully. So another tick there on scale. The final piece then was, as Mirvac, looking at ourselves, do we think we're in the right position to enter this space? One of the big keys of build to rent is scale, and I'm sure we'll touch on the importance of that. And for groups such as ourselves and Lendlease that have large pipelines and the ability to put in scale plus a delivery capability, you put all that together, and we're very excited about the sector.
By the way, I should say to the audience, our session is actually quite a short session. So if anyone wants to jump in with a question, just wave your hand and we'll try to get a mic to you, or just take the question from the floor. Picking up on that last point of scale, and Ken, in your presentation, you mentioned some of the moves in the UK and setting up some government support in terms of funding. Could you elaborate on that? I suppose government role in fostering scale, which is a big issue.
Sure. So in the UK, they've moved from a standing start in the GFC to now having about 100,000 dwellings either built or going through the pipeline or in the planning stages. So quite successful. So what scale? Well, you need to be able to access a vehicle to to put the investment in. So you need to be able to access the managed investment trust. There will be players who will choose a company structure, but it's you know, if you're talking about doing this at scale, then you need to use what the industry uses to convert capital into build product, and that's a managed investment trust, a REIT structure. So you need to be not blocked from that. You should be taxed fairly, the same as you would a shopping centre or an office building, not double as others have suggested. And then you need to look at some of the blockages, recognising that if you're trying to start from a standing start, there'll be a mix of support that might be need to be locked in, but then support that might be a transitional issue. So, you know, some of these things are, what's the role of build to rent within the planning system? You know, how does it sit there? How do councils approach it? What sort of scope and incentive might it be given from state governments? There's also the taxation issues. So once you go to, you know, build to rent, then you're in commercial land tax sort of levels. So you've got quite a high land tax requirement on these assets. And of course, what you're trying to do is take residential as an investment from the current mum and dad, very capital gain focused, to being a more institutional income led. So anything that adds operating expenses, it narrows that surplus is working against the achievement of that. You know, lowers that yield and makes it harder for income to come in, for investment to come in. So look, and there's quite a strong sustainability link, because what you get from the Lend-Leases and the Mirvacs and the other institutional players in this space is when they look at this product, they're able to bring all their smarts from their sustainability smarts from the other property sectors into not just building residential, but owning and operating it. So that operating efficiency becomes much more to the fore with residential, where it's much harder to do, and certainly happens a lot less because it's a build to sell product rather than a build to rent product.
Well, that's actually a great segue back to some of the things that Tony was saying about the culture of renting in developments like this. It also picks up on some of the themes that the conference opened with this morning about sustainability and the way the sector is moving just from sustainability into healthy, well buildings, and the new criteria for assessing that, which is some of the points you're making now. And Tony, picking up on one of your earlier points, the culture within a build-to-rent project, and you mentioned, I guess, having a single landlord and what that means for renters. Could you sort of expand on that a little bit?
I think having that single ownership brings a lot of benefits to both renters and also for sustainability outcomes. So you have a building, it's in single ownership. You're not, as an owner of a building, you're not building or developing to sell and make a profit. What you're interested in doing is to make money, is to keep the tenant there. So therefore, you have to get pretty innovative, and you have to really think about the customer who's the tenant, and provide a level of service so that you actually keep them there. So you look at creating a community. You look at the things that make it a place where you want to live and you don't want to leave. So, you know, there's a lot more amenity in these buildings, a lot more spaces where you have the opportunity to engage with other people or not, but you have an ability to, you don't have to just live in your apartment, you can escape it. There are places to go. There's a curation of communities, so there's a central team managing a particular building, so there's a central team that will lease that building. So when you're actually looking to go and lease something, you know that you turn up to the building, there's a professional there who will take you through a building, take you through what is a nice leasing experience. I know I recently leased something temporarily and I had to rock up to the building, and it was me and 25 other people and I was just a number, and it was 3 minutes of quick run in, look at it, out the door, and you're on a list, and if you're lucky you'll get it. So that doesn't exist. It's a much nicer experience. Something goes wrong with the apartment that you're in, you call a number, somebody will be there to fix it for you straight away. At the moment, if you're renting, something goes wrong, you're at the mercy of an agent. And there are sustainability benefits. So if the building is in one ownership, it's in that owner's interest, again, to make sure the operating costs of that building are lower. So they're going to be looking at innovative ways of making sure that you're keeping the costs down. But from a service perspective, you're also thinking about your tenant and how to keep their costs down, so the costs of their outgoings down, because that'll make them want to stay in your building. Therefore, you're going to spend, a bit more money and a bit more time and a bit more thought in thinking about how you're putting a building together so that you're lowering their costs. So there are, I think there are so many benefits over and above the current rental market in Australia.
And did you want to come in, Adam?
Yeah, I think this all touches on it, but the subtle but major change in this model is who is the customer. So you think in a traditional mum and dad investor product, you bring in a residential property manager, their real customer is the owner of the apartment, not actually the tenant, and they're focused on keeping the relationship with the owner and keeping the owner happy, not on the actual experience of the tenant within that apartment. In a build-to-rent model, you cut out that middleman because the owner and the manager is the same person, and all of a sudden, all the focus shifts to the tenant and the tenant experience, because that is the critical piece of the performance of your asset, the ongoing occupancy, and how that performs long term. So it's that subtle shift that makes a big difference in the outcome for the tenants within there.
Yeah. Well, just on that point, I mean, it's a cultural shift for tenants. It's a cultural shift, I suppose, for landlords too. That's what we're here today talking about. This change of developers adopting a model of becoming landlords of residential property. From where you stand, Adam, what do you see as being the benefits for a developer to move into a residential asset that they hold?
I mean, there's a few major ones. The first one is really around the nature of this model sitting alongside a traditional build-to-sell model. The volatility of build-to-sell pre-sales and financing markets makes it quite a volatile market, whereas in a rental model it's far more stable and secure, so it allows you to really deliver supply through cycle, and that's one of the big major points for government as well. Another really interesting piece that is in the fact that you're building and owning long term, and the data and information that you can get out of these buildings. So typically when we develop strata buildings, once we've sold them all, we're out of there, and there's not a lot of information that we're getting back. We see this as a massive opportunity for both build to rent and to then come back into build to sell in the long term as well.
Yeah. As you've been speaking, someone in the audience has come in with a hard-hitting question that I wish I'd asked, actually. So, Tony, I'll read it out, but you might want to take this one on because it perhaps goes into some of that rental culture. The question is, if your organisation is operating in a build-to-rent market as the landlord, how do you pick and choose your tenants so that your assets have the right mix of people from different demographic backgrounds, socially rich or poor, or even ethnic background? I mean, so how do you pick your tenants? How do you manage that? And Lendlease has got that experience, I suppose, overseas.
It's a big question. I can throw in that we manage 40,000 homes in the US. Adam said, don't show off.
We were waiting for that one.
We have a really big military housing portfolio in the US where we do develop, build and oversee 40,000 homes, and it's military personnel. So they range from the newest entrant right through to generals, etc. I don't even know what the ranks are, but I think what build to rent, what it allows us to do is you've got different product typologies, and I think with the scale of buildings, so when you're designing a building, what you want ideally in a build to rent building is a really big mix of product. So it allows you to attract very different types of tenants and a very wide-ranging demographic, because we believe that it's important that you have a mix. We wouldn't like to see the same. I don't think that makes for good community. I don't think in either of our experiences working in development. Do we want to see that? So I think a really big advantage, and this is where we need some planning assistance, is we need some flexibility in how we design these buildings so that we do get a really big mix of product that allows us to target a lot of different a lot of different types of people, from those who can't afford to pay very much to those who can afford to pay something more, whilst offering the amenity to all in a building. So I think that's key. The second thing is the build-to-rent sector. It obviously hasn't taken off yet here. It's kind of on the cusp. It needs a bit of assistance. You'll see a couple of projects come on, but we're talking about trying to create something of scale. What we would like to see, and because the returns at this point aren't, it's getting closer to returns of other asset classes, but it's not quite there yet. What we would really like to see, if we did get some government assistance, that would allow us potentially to introduce some affordable components to attract other tenants who perhaps sit in like a key worker space or an more affordable space. So there is scope to do that if we can get that level of assistance, and it creates again a mixed community within a building. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
no, it does, and it's also a great link back to Ken, because I wanted to bring Ken back into the conversation on the topic of government assistance. It sounds like there's gridlock, roadblock, chaos in Canberra, business as usual, but you did give us a bit of seeds of hope at the state level, and I think you mentioned in the presentation both New South Wales, Victoria have working committees on the topic. What's the nudge that state legislations could give that might help?
So I talked about land tax, I talked about planning, but just to bring out planning more. For build to rent to work, it's not, it needs to be at a certain scale. So there'll be significantly sized apartment blocks that sort of need support in the planning system. Councils need to understand that what the players are trying to do is something different here. So they need to have a supportive planning framework when they're looking at that. But to get what Tony's talking about, some of that affordable housing partnership, that's where government might decide if it's disposing of sites which are surplus to requirements, it might mandate some build to rent on that site, some affordable rental on that site, I should say. And that way, whoever it is that's bidding for that site could say, okay, well, I know I can factor that into my feasibility. There also might be planning incentives in place by a council or by a state government as incentives. You might get extra density for doing some extra affordable rental stock, or indeed there might be some tax incentives, and that's another lever that the federal government could also do. In fact, the Treasurer has flagged that and put a proposal on the table as part of the draft legislation, also in the last budget. It's just not a particularly powerful one. So that could be strengthened up, and that could accelerate the investment of capital, both offshore and domestic, into build to rent as well.
We're coming close to time, but Adam, did you see a kind of a catalyst there that could nudge the sector into life in a bigger scale in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, Ken summarised the government piece well there. A lot of it is about indication as well of support from government, just showing that there is an intention to push this sector and to want this sector to happen. A lot of the discussions we're having with capital sources comes back to that piece. We can invest in Europe, we can invest in the UK, we can invest in the US, where the government welcomes this type of investment because it's more housing, it's secure housing, and it's good quality product. It's hard for us to go to our investment committee when there's not these positive signals coming out of the government in Australia. So that's definitely one piece. And I think the second piece is really just having some actual projects completed that people can touch and walk through and feel, because once you see this product and once you see the offering and the service offering within these buildings, you get it and you get what this can be. It really starts to crystallise in your mind what it can be as a sector.
Thanks, Adam. I think we might just be able to squeeze in one last question from the audience, which has come up on the screen. Might be one for you, Tony. How do we...
the hard ones.
Yeah. No comment. So the question is, how do we make sure build to rent is affordable in the longer term when developers have high yield thresholds year on year based on value? So it's the numbers question again.
It is a numbers question, but I think when we talk about build to rent, and I think people hear about all the services that come with it, the amenity, etc. We're not talking about necessarily a luxury product. We're talking about a market product. So we're in the market competing for competing for people to rent our buildings. So there's a natural market force that's going to keep it at a level. How do you keep it affordable? I'm not sure if the question is, are we talking about housing affordability or are we talking about affordable housing? So they're two different things. So I think...
No, it's across line, I think.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
I didn't like it was coming back to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that point is if they don't like it, they can move out next door. So that market force will keep rentals at a competitive level, and you'll have some product which might be at a slightly higher end, and others which will be a more affordable end. But as I described earlier, governments have got the opportunity to incentivise the provision of affordable housing, affordable rental housing, and they can't do that if that private sector doesn't exist. If players like Lendlease and Mirvac and others are not in the space, then they've got no one to partner with.
Okay, I think we're out of time now. There's some really great thoughts there that you've canvassed very quickly in a short amount of time, so thank you for that. I'm just actually thinking, perhaps by the time this conference comes around again next year, we might be actually talking about projects that are in the ground, spurred on by all of these thoughts today. So can we put our hands together for the panel today? Thanks very much. Thanks, guys.
Great job. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Ken, Tony, Adam, and of course Nick. What a great opportunity this presents for Australia. Antoinette's going to kill me. That was far too garbled. Please join with me in thanking our panel again. Folks, we don't normally run a newswire at Green Cities HQ, but I do feel somehow compelled to mention that renowned cosmologist and all-round great human being Stephen Hawking has passed today peacefully at 76. And obviously he's had a profound influence on the planet, and I thought while we're having lofty thoughts, it's worth sparing a thought for someone who overcame quite remarkable challenges in their own life to make a huge contribution to everyone else. On an entirely more upbeat note, we are going to enjoy the next session, the energising power of nature, because as the world goes more urban, we have a fundamental task ahead, and I know all of you are closely aware of this in this room, to make the world's cities ecologically rich and emotionally satisfying. So how can we harness the power of nature to improve the experience of city life? To answer this important question and more, I am thrilled to be joined by two of the industry's leading thinkers and change makers in this area. I'm going to introduce them one at a time. They'll present, and then we'll do some Q&A, which again will be fiendishly abrupt, and I'm sorry for the tight Q&A today, but please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Pascal Mittermeier, Global Managing Director, Cities, the Nature Conservancy, who will present to kick us off.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The title of my presentation today is Bringing the Power of Nature into Cities to Help Make Them More Resilient and Livable Places. So before we get into that, what's the problem we're trying to solve? This is a picture of the Cheonggyecheong district in Seoul, in Korea, taken sometime early in the 1960s. We could have picked any city because it's really representative how we built and designed our cities over the last 100 years. Asphalt, concrete, very heavy focus on cars. The space of cars to people is somewhere between 10 or 50 to 1. Not so much nature, not a lot of focus on people at ground level. And you can see a freeway running through the middle of a neighborhood, which is very typical of the way we build cities. And in this case, underneath the freeway here, the Chongqing River, which when this photo was taken, was already abused and polluted to the point of being almost lifeless. So yes, it's Korea, but I think everyone in this room can recognize that there's elements of this in almost every city in the world that we go to today. So what are the environmental consequences of the way that we've built our cities in the past? Well, the first one is intense and even deadly urban heat. So heat island effect in cities is now the #1 natural disaster killer in cities, killing more than all other natural disasters combined. And I chose this picture because it's from a particularly deadly heat event that happened in Paris a decade ago. And like all heat events, it particularly touched fragile and elderly people. And 15,000 people died in Paris that year. And when you look at a map of where most of the damage was done, there's a direct correlation with how much nature and tree canopy was in the neighborhoods at the time. So not only is heat an example of an environmental crisis or an environmental challenge, there are also strong elements of social justice and underserved communities and elder people living in cities. So heat is a major challenge due to the way we've built our cities. Another example is air pollution. There's not a mayor we don't meet who doesn't talk to us about air pollution in the first few minutes. So polluted air, in particular fine particle pollution, kills 6 million people every year, with tens of millions more suffering from asthma and from other important diseases. And it's not just LA. It's all kinds of smaller cities. It's Cincinnati, it's Houston, it's Milan, it's Paris, and even in cities where the air is relatively clean, such as Melbourne or Sydney, there are pockets with particularly polluted air. What about the water that hits cities? How do cities that are drenched in asphalt and concrete deal with water? Well, in most cases, the water touches down on the pavement and flows at high speed, collecting all the debris and pollutant into the sewer systems and then directly into the rivers and the ocean. And for most cities, this is the #1 cause of pollution for our rivers and our oceans. What about the people that live in these cities? Well, it shouldn't be a surprise that many of the people are very disconnected from nature. They don't benefit from the wonder and the health and wellness that nature offers. And especially young people today are very disconnected. So as in this picture, a lot of youngsters spend somewhere between 5 and 7 hours on a device, but less than 30 on a device per day, but less than 30 minutes of outdoor time a week. A lot of teenagers in the US can identify more than 1,000 corporate brands and logos, but less than 5 native species. There's a study that they do in the UK every year. They ask 20,000 young people, what's it feel like when you put your hand in a bucket of soil, or if a caterpillar crawls across your skin? And it's always a response that's one of anxiety and fear. So we have people living in cities that are very disconnected from nature. And obviously for us environmentalists, this is a problem, but it's also a challenge on, well, what happens to these cities in the next decades when people that don't have any exposure to nature start making decisions on sustainability? So back to the Chongqing in 1960, as I mentioned, even the most livable city in the world, 8 years running, has examples of this somewhere in its urban footprint. Look at that same view today. So about 10 years ago, the highway overpass was removed and the Chongqing River was daylighted. Today the river is so clean, there are 4 species of fish swimming here that haven't been in this river in 50 years. The temperature down there is 5 degrees Celsius cooler than on the adjacent sidewalk. This whole thing acts as the storm emergency, 1 in 200 year flood emergency for the city of Seoul. If you're a bird or an insect, you can now travel through the city without it being an obstacle. And finally, really importantly, look at the connection people now have to their city. And the mayor of Seoul declared this is what gave Seoul its soul back. So let's unpack how we can use this example and use nature as a way to make cities more resilient and livable. So this first example is about managing water using nature. This is a wondrous little device, a wondrous little construction called a rain garden or a swale. You can see the break in the pavement when it rains. The soil and the roots filter the water and slow it down, and what goes into the system is much less and much cleaner already. There are also little financial masterpieces, and many cities are now using this as a really cost-effective way to manage their water, much more cost-effective than designing expensive water treatment facilities with cisterns and underground pumps. The most famous case that we're working with is the city of Philadelphia that has already greened up 1,000 city acres with this kind of green infrastructure. This is a project we're working on in Seattle, 20,000 swales to help manage Seattle's stormwater. In the distance you can see Puget Sound, and if that rain garden weren't there, the water would flow down at high speed into the city, into the water. But where this gets really exciting is when we map out entire cities. This is a small city about an hour north of New York called Bridgeport in Connecticut. And you can see the city has designed a whole series of green infrastructure projects to stop polluted stormwater from flowing out into the Long Island Sound. You can also see this big green area at the bottom, which was designed after Superstorm Sandy to stop waves and sea level surges from crashing into the city. So green infrastructure helps with polluted water coming out, but it also helps protect cities from storms and sea surges. And this is from my hometown in Boston. This is a project that we're working on with the city of Boston, mapping out permeable, nature-based storm and sea level surge protection, primarily to preserve the city of Cambridge, which is the home of Harvard and MIT. And here's another example of the work that we're doing to map out the potential of nature to absorb water, this time to preserve and protect Logan Airport in Boston. So green has really the potential to help cities manage resiliency from storms and sea level rise, but also manage how water flows out of a city. So the next chapter is focused on air quality. And the hero here is the leaf, or more precisely, the little hairs on the leaves that have an incredible ability to filter fine particle pollution, somewhere in the range of 20 to 50% in a neighborhood context. So this is not about planting millions of trees across the city, but really understanding which neighborhoods and which targeted areas can have the biggest return on investment. So last year we released a report called Planting Healthy Air, which did exactly that, looked at 245 of the biggest cities in the world, and really tried to understand where it made sense to plant trees for the highest return on investment. So these are looking at prevailing winds, densities, traffic, and so on. And on the right-hand side, you can see a map of Washington, D.C. that starts to help mayors and city planners understand where it makes sense to plant trees. One of our most exciting projects is in the city of Louisville in Kentucky. Louisville is very famous for bourbon, but it's also unfortunately famous for particularly bad air. And so you can see these green dots where the Nature Conservancy and the city of Louisville are mapping out where it makes sense to put trees. So we're planting 8,000 trees, and then the University Medical School in Louisville is measuring the health of the people in this neighborhood and comparing it to a neighborhood that hasn't been greened up. It's the first major clinical trial that's being launched with nature as the pharmaceutical. It's a 5-year study, and it'll measure cardiovascular health, bronchopulmonary health, mental health, so it's really exciting work. In this study also, there are 1,200 young people with asthma inhalers. The inhalers have a little GPS on them, and so every time they take a puff, we can identify if they're doing this in an area that's enriched with nature or not. So this is really connecting nature with health benefits and really trying to redefine nature not just as something nice to have in parks and recreation, but crucial to the well-being and health of people in cities. It's just some examples of how we're designing the different kinds of trees and how we're mapping out neighborhood by neighborhood where we should be planting the trees and how to convince local people to give up their private land and plant a tree for the common good of the air quality. And this is a picture of the laboratory, so the scientific work that's being done to connect the pharmaceutical effect of trees with more than 30 different laboratory markers, diagnostic markers. So another major reason to work with nature in cities is to connect people, especially young people, with nature. So you're going to hear in the next presentation the power of nature in terms of health and well-being, but it's really crucial in the development of young people, giving young people a sense of aesthetics and justice and really having them understand the power and wonder of nature and what it can do. And so all of our projects focus not just on solving environmental or ecological issues, but really trying to connect people as much as possible with nature. So what you can see here is a project in a relatively underserved community in Birmingham in Alabama. A lot of these kids have never really understood anything regarding the power of trees or have never been exposed or involved with a nature planting project. And it's amazing to see what happens when people like this are exposed to this kind of work, and the programs that we run often follow what happens with young people as they work through high school and the kind of university applications they do, and it's amazing how many of them then choose a path of science or biology or environmental science. So connecting young people with nature is really something we want to do, and connecting young people who traditionally haven't had the kind of nature exposure that a lot of us did in our childhood is really important. Something else amazing happens when you bring nature into neighborhoods. Nature transforms neighborhoods. So what you can see here is the project in Philadelphia. This is pretty much a typical neighborhood that we worked in. Looked very much like many of the neighborhoods you would see, and flooded on a regular basis. And then nature becomes a catalyst, and when nature is brought into a neighborhood, you can see more kids playing outside, more parents interacting with their kids, more people interested in food growing and looking after community gardens, more people walking, more people cycling. And in this particular example in Philadelphia, we even observed that people who are exposed to nature in their neighborhoods care more about energy efficiency and even solar panels. And the best example I can think of a major nature project that was inspired by what nature could bring is a project I worked on, Lend-Lease's Elephant and Castle project in central London. You can see nature really being everywhere in this picture, and including the largest new park in London, which acted as a stormwater basin for this development. So the final point I want to make is the power of nature to help visualize what's possible. So too many times environmentalists talk about don't fly, don't eat meat, don't wear leather. There's too much time spending on making things slightly less bad or avoiding them altogether. What you can see here is how the city of Paris is talking about the year 2040 or the year 2050. You're standing on top of Notre Dame. You're looking out towards the Eiffel Tower, and look at the role that nature plays in this positive communication of what a great, sustainable green city could be. So nature is absolutely involved with all of the other modern trends: energy efficiency, driverless cars. You can even see a little driverless boat there on the Seine. People walking, people cycling, growing food up and down buildings. This is a place, I think, where people want to live and where people want to work. And it's very different from just describing how we're going to make things slightly less bad. And so the Nature Conservancy also has a really cool project here in Melbourne. Our colleagues are working with the 32 councils to map out the urban forest, to look at what could happen with biodiversity across all 32 councils, and then to understand what the impacts could be in terms of shade, in terms of air quality, in terms of equity, and in terms of connecting people with nature. So, and the wonderful thing is if we do it in Paris and in Melbourne, there'll be lots of other cities that will want to emulate and copy this. Mayors are really proactive at copying each other's ideas. Everyone, nobody wants to be the first. Everyone wants to be second or third and then say that they were the first. So I'll leave you with this, but this is really an example of how this doesn't have to be a pipe dream. We can really work block by block, project by project, and create the kind of scale that'll turn cities like Paris and Melbourne into this positive vision. Thank you.
Now, yes, you're welcome to sit down momentarily, Pascal. I'm glad you're on the case and going far further than making things slightly less bad. I feel very calm in your capable hands. Now, please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Jackie Shermer. Jackie is Associate Professor, Health Research Institute and Institute for Applied Ecology, University of Canberra. Please make her most welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so Pascal's done a brilliant job of talking about how we can bring nature into outdoor spaces in cities and be energised by that. I get to talk about bringing nature indoors and what that can do for well-being. See if the little button works. There we go. All right. Now, when I think about energising and being energised by nature, I immediately think about well-being, and there's a good reason for that. I'm a well-being researcher, so I work in the field of health, and I'm afraid I'm about to break some of the rules talked about by Tim earlier. He talked about not presenting endless facts and figures. I am going to do a little bit of that. I'm even going to present some graphs. My apologies for that, but I will put it in a narrative for you. And the first part of that narrative is understanding why well-being is not just a nice-to-have thing, it's actually a bottom-line essential. So we often hear people talking about, we need to improve people's well-being. It's often hard to think about what is it we mean by that? What do we achieve when we do that? If you look at the World Health Organization and their definitions of what well-being means, if someone with a good state of well-being is someone who is able to contribute to their workplace to be more productive, someone who's able to cope with the challenges life throws at them, and someone who can contribute to their community. These things are really important to have in and of themselves. They also have important benefits for the economy in terms of reduced healthcare costs, reduced social costs, and increased benefits for the community. And in recognition of that, we're seeing increasingly lots and lots of international organisations who are shifting to using measures of well-being as measures of progress. Everything from the International Day of Happiness coming up on March 20th, everyone should celebrate it, through to the OECD, who produced their Better Life Index because an organisation for economic cooperation and development recognises we need well-being for economic progress. Bringing it back to what I'm going to talk about today, though, I'm going to focus on talking about indoor spaces and worker well-being. Why should you invest in worker well-being? If you invest in improving the well-being of people in a workplace, the engagement of your employees will increase dramatically, sick leave and absenteeism will go down, usually around a quarter if you do your work well, and workers' compensation will go down. On balance, you get a benefit of around $5.80 for every dollar invested. All right, one of the first questions I often get asked is, well, look, especially in Australia, worker wellbeing is pretty good. Do we really have a need to do anything about it? Do we need to improve things? The short answer is there's always room for improvement. Recent work, the work I'm talking about today, has shown 35% of people who work indoors in Australia are not satisfied with their work, and 28% of them in the last year have taken some leave, which even they themselves say they didn't really need to take, they just didn't feel like going to work. I won't ask for hands up of who's done that. But importantly, if you're more satisfied with your work, which is associated with well-being, you are much less likely to be taking that unplanned, unnecessary leave. So we do need to constantly think about this. And when we think about how to improve worker well-being, if we want to be as happy as these young millennials in this beautiful picture, there's some things we can do. We can have a positive workplace culture, a safe workplace. We can help people engage in meaningful work that they really can feel engaged in. We can give people good conditions, pay in hours, and they're all things that we've done a lot of work in. That's the reason why only 35% of people are somewhat dissatisfied with their work. That's actually probably a lot better than we would have heard about a few decades ago. The other thing we can work on is their workplace environment. And that brings me to the promise of nature connection. So Edward O. Wilson, a really famous biologist in the 1980s, proposed what's now called the biophilia hypothesis, that humans have an innate need to affiliate with nature. We have a biological need to be close to nature, and that when we construct built environments that distance us from nature, our health and our well-being suffer. Now, when that was proposed, there wasn't actually a whole lot of evidence for it. In the decades since, we've seen huge growth of evidence for it, particularly in the outdoor environment, as Pascal was talking about. But what we do know now is that bringing nature connection and access to contact with lots of different forms of nature is good for your health and your well-being, and has positive effects on human health in multiple ways. And associated with that, we've seen the rise of biophilic design, the idea that we need a science, an art, a process of bringing buildings to life. One of the challenges though, and this is where my academic nature comes in, quite often we talk about these things, but we don't always actually have enough solid evidence to back it up. So I'm just going to give you some examples. There's some common things that are done in biophilic design, common elements. Let's look at how good the evidence is for each of them. The first one's natural light. I don't know about you, but when I think about natural light, I'd love to have some at the moment. But there's tons of evidence. If you're in a workspace or a home with better natural light, your health and well-being is better. The same thing with having a view of nature, being able to look out to nature, your health and well-being is better. Interestingly, having images of nature on the walls, a photograph or a painting, reasonably strong evidence that that improves your well-being, and that gives us some options for places where you can't knock a hole and provide a view outside to nature. Plants, plenty of evidence for improving health through having plants outdoors, slightly less for bringing them indoors because there are some complications, but done right, absolutely has benefits for health and well-being. But biophilic design also argues we should be using wooden surfaces, other natural surfaces, natural forms where we shape our buildings in spiral patterns or patterns that mimic natural forms and water features. And there's not nearly as much evidence for that. And I'm going to focus particularly on wood because it's one of the most commonly used materials in workspaces, and yet we haven't had the evidence to say, should we think of this as a biophilic design element or not? We hear a lot of people saying we think we should, but until now we haven't really had good hard evidence for it. So the reason I'm talking about that is that last year I was asked to review some work that had been done by Pollinate, who are a market research company, and they engage in some really good research that connects health, markets, economy, social responsibility. They do great stuff. They'd been commissioned by the Forest and Wood Products Australia to do a survey of 1,000 Australian indoor workers, representative by age, gender and location. Sorry, the nerd bit will be over soon, I promise. And I was brought in to say, we think we've found a strong connection between both having traditional biophilic elements in the workplace, your plants, your natural light, but also timber surfaces. And I said, yeah, I'll review for you, but I actually am a bit sceptical because I think that what you might be seeing is the fact that a lot of people who are wealthier, have more high-end offices, have more of these things, and also happen to have better well-being. Much to my surprise, I ended up finding out that that research was pretty strong, and that's why I'm here talking about it today. It's some of the best evidence we have that bringing nature indoors has a really big impact. So the first thing that the work looked at was, is nature connection missing in Australian workplaces? And the short answer is yes. There's about half of all workers who spend less than 1 hour outside on a workday. So we want to connect people to nature outside, but we are spending increasing amounts of time inside. We need to bring nature indoors as well. Just over half aren't satisfied with their connection to nature in their workplace, and 1 in 4 can't see a biophilic element from their workstation. So if you ask people, can you see an exposed wood surface? Can you see natural light? Can you see a plant from where you're working? 26% said they can't see any of those. Of those who could see them, the most common thing they could see was an exposed wooden surface that looked natural. So it might be floorboards, might be a bit of ceiling panelling, might be a desk or a table. Natural light, less than half of people. A window with a view of nature, only 2 in 5 workers. Indoor plants, 2 in 5, and it goes downwards from there. All right, here's my horrendograph. I'm not going to talk through it too much, but my job was to throw everything I could at this data and see if I could disprove what it thought it had found. So I got to get my statistics on, which for me is one of my happiest things. This is how I improve my well-being. And I spent a day sitting in my office, and by the end of the day I was looking around my office going, I've got a little bit of natural light, I don't have any timber, I don't have any plants, and I went out and bought about 5 plants the next day and put them in my office. It's a really strong relationship, surprisingly strong. So I rarely get to play with data that shows this strong a connection. If you have none of your non-wood biophilic elements present, so this is your natural light, nature views, plants, none of those are in your office, there's a 1 in 2 chance you are dissatisfied with your work and that you have poor well-being. And poor well-being is associated with a shorter lifespan, lower work productivity, more absenteeism, higher health costs. It has really important impacts. When you head up to the very top end, someone who's got lots and lots of biophilic elements in their workplace, and there were not very many people who did have that very top end, your work satisfaction is through the roof, and your well-being has gone up so that 4/5 of people have high levels of well-being. That's a pretty strong relationship. It held even when you control for income, for workplace culture, for age. By the way, anyone here who doesn't know it, by the time you hit 65, your well-being goes up. You're more satisfied with life. And if you're a woman, you're slightly happier than if you're a man. So just to set that in context, we were controlling for all of that. If you're able to personalise your workspace, you tend to be happier, so we controlled for that. If you're in a place with a good workplace culture, you're happier, so we controlled for that. Now, what we found in the end of that, even if you are a young male worker working in a place where you don't feel your work is meaningful, where you can't personalise your workspace, where you don't like the people you're working for, if you have biophilic elements present, you are happier and your well-being is higher after we controlled for all that. That's what really surprised me and got me really excited about this work. We then looked at wood separately on its own because it's not been shown to have these effects previously. Even though we all like wood, we know everyone loves having wooden surfaces, but it hadn't been shown to have this effect on well-being more specifically. And it showed a really similar result. Similar thing, no wood in the workplace, we have that negative association. More wood up to a point is pretty good for your well-being. The up to a point is that if you have 100% wood panelling versus, say, a nice wooden floor and maybe a wooden desk, you have about the same effect. So it doesn't get more after a certain point. You don't have to have a log cabin to be perfectly happy. The effects of wood actually added to the other biophilic elements. If you had wood and the others, the effect was much stronger on your well-being. So that's really exciting as well. And so that's why I'm really excited to be here and get to formally launch Pollinate's report on wellness plus wood equals productivity. I'd encourage you all to go out and grab a copy of it from the Wood Solutions stand. And they document in there more of the findings around workplace productivity and presence of wooden surfaces. So things like people were better able to concentrate at work, better able to think and create, reported having a better mood and felt their personal productivity was better if they had more wooden surfaces and more biophilic elements in general in their workplace. Now, I'm almost done, but there's a couple things we need to think about. While I'm really excited that we are finally getting some of this hard evidence, we still lack it in a lot of places. So one of the challenges is when we talk biophilic design, one of the biggest temptations is to put up the amazing pictures of these grand designs of new buildings that have been designed from scratch to have biophilic forms, to have plants cascading down. But the everyday situation for a lot of builders and designers is that they are doing endless retrofits of old office buildings. We need a biophilic toolbox where you've got tools you can use to introduce nature in all those situations. So we need to expand our biophilic toolbox. We need to make sure we can bring nature indoors in every situation, not just the optimal situations. The other thing we're seeing from this research and other research is that one plant is not enough. Putting one plant on a windowsill tends to be a bit of a response. It was actually mine the day after I started doing this work, and then I rapidly added 5 more when I realised one plant wasn't enough. But having 4 or 5 biophilic elements, that's where we really start to see significant and large well-being impacts on work satisfaction that we know will flow through to work productivity. So 1 plant's not enough, we need a little bit more. And we need to keep expanding the toolbox. So if I was you, I'd be sitting there thinking, I want her to explain the statistics in so much more detail. No one's hand went up there. That makes me very sad, but anyway. But the other thing I'd be thinking is, I've got all these questions about which types of wood, what's natural enough to be a natural wooden surface? Can we use veneer? Can we use constructed timber? In this study, people simply asked, can you see natural looking unpainted wood? So it was what they felt was natural looking. We need to find out more about that and see when do we get that wellbeing benefit. We also need to do that with plants. We need to do it with a range of these other biophilic design options. We need to keep developing the toolbox. Now finally, I've been talking and being very excited about bringing wellbeing into the workplace through introducing nature. The business case for biophilic design absolutely exists. Our biophilic toolbox is expanding, but we also need to bear in mind what everyone in the room already knows, that we need to take care of nature outdoors when we're connecting to it indoors. Because we can't just assume that if we connect people to nature, that will always be sustainable. We need to think about things like impacts on water use and energy. It's one of the biggest tensions is when you propose building something and having a great view to nature and lots of natural light, you're increasing your glass surfaces. You may be reducing your energy efficiency if you don't think about it the right way. So we have to think about that carefully and not assume this means a 360-degree glass-covered sort of building. There are different ways we can achieve that are sustainable. So I'll finish up by saying biophilic design must use sustainably sourced materials. What's great is that lots and lots of people, including many in this room, already work in that space. Let's just make sure we keep working together on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, take a seat, please. Pascal, why don't you come up? We've got an ominously short amount of time, don't we? What have we got? We've got 7 minutes. Jackie, that was a great presentation, and I'm going to use my privileged position to ask you a specialist question. If you had a preferred plant, right, let's say there's not a lot of foliage in the office, are there any varieties that are particularly worth going for early on?
Ooh, it depends what sort of person you are and how well you're going to take care of your plant.
So can I give you an example? Stockland headquarters in Sydney has what colloquially is referred to as mother-in-law's tongue, which is quite a robust looking plant, as that trope might imagine, but and I don't know the scientific name, otherwise I would have used it because I'm not a misogynist pig, but the qualities of the plant are that it produces a particularly high interaction with oxygen, and it refines the air, etc., etc. So is it succulents? What's your first cab off the rank for making people feel that there's something alive in the office that's not them?
Yeah. Look, I guess what we tend to go for first is something that can cope with low light in most offices, and something that has that really big green leafy ratio that can do a lot of that oxygen exchange. But it's not the only consideration, because if those are also the sorts of plants that aren't going to be taken care of, you might be better off with your succulent. So we need to think about that in different workplaces. For me, I travel a lot, so I tend to go more the succulent end, where I can water them and leave them for a week.
Yes, Property Council of Australia, Victoria staff, we're on succulents, I think, given my own experience with plants. Jeff, I'm going to totally bypass you and go to the lady up there with her hand up, just at the back. But it's not for lack of love, Jeff, obviously.
I'm Adelaide from SALT. This question is specifically targeted at Pascal. So a lot of the development that's happening in Melbourne at the moment is residential subdivisions, and my understanding is that often these subdivisions are requested to install swales or rain gardens, but then in practice, because the land is body corporate, not run by local government, the swales get disused, poorly managed, and actually don't achieve anything that they were set out to do. So I was wondering if you could reflect on some of the challenges that you see in the work you do, and any recommendations or any strategies you have to overcome those.
Yeah, I think an example I can give you is on the kind of work that we're doing in in Louisville, where we're trying to plant 8,000 trees, and roughly half the trees will be planted on private land. So I think a really important element is to create this engaging vision that goes from individual homeowners all the way to community and faith groups, all the way to the city and the neighborhood. And so a lot of this work, I think, is creating this bigger common vision, and then putting in place a series of not just top-down, but more community-based governance features that'll help in the management of that. I think, it's a challenge on whose job it is, and I think there's probably many different solutions. Sorry if I didn't answer your question properly. I think I'm trying to think, Michael. So, for example, I know that in the Elephant and Castle we built some swales, and what happened is exactly what you described. So some of the maintenance people ended up throwing their yard trimmings into those swales, and so we had to go back and redefine what good looked like. And so I guess those would be the two experiences that I have on that front.
He's more persistent than a succulent. Narelle and then Jeff. Narelle, may I? Lucky last, Jeff.
Jeff, you got a question? I'm interested in the fascinating presentations, thank you both, and I can see a big channel near my house that needs this attention right now. I'm interested in the cost differentials and how that might be factored in planning and projects and so forth. Thanks.
Do you mean specifically around some of the examples I gave? So the most powerful example I can think of is the city of Philadelphia. So Philadelphia was under an Environmental Protection Agency consent decree. A tremendous amount of pollution was flowing into the river around Philadelphia. And the typical traditional solution would have been a water treatment facility, 30 miles of underground pipes. These are pipes that are 10 meters in diameter, pumping stations, cisterns, and the whole project was known in Philadelphia as the 100-year chain. So it was $10 billion, 100-year to pay it back. And so it was actually the Philadelphia Water Department that started exploring the green infrastructure, and they were the ones who started doing this. It wasn't the Department of Parks or of Recreation. It was the Water Department that did this, and the initial impetus was one of cost saving. And I'll just say that so they've greened up 1,000 inner city acres, and the ambition now for Philadelphia is to do 10,000 acres to manage its entire stormwater using only green infrastructure. That would be a first in the world.
Yeah, look, when it comes to cost, I guess one of the challenges for me is we see this tension between short-term costs, the cost of what you're doing right now, and the longer-term benefits. One of the reasons we see it being really important to build the business case for biophilic design is so there is a better evidence base to say if you spend 5% more now, you can get a much bigger benefit in the future. And that's also why it's important to expand that biophilic toolbox, because if we can say, well, if you can't do the really amazing natural forms, if you can bring in some timber into your office, we're now saying that can be something. We're getting more and more options for different cost situations, which I think is fantastic.
We're going to actually close out with a question that came from the screen. Sorry, Jeff, because we've got the big red zeros of doom, but there was a really interesting question for you, Jackie, around the demand for builders doing a cost-effective retrofit, with maintenance in mind, using plastic plants. Is there a biophilic benefit there at all?
That's a really good question. I wish my answer was no, but there's been very little study done of plastic plants and the benefits. There's been one that I'm aware of, and it showed that while real plants have a much, much better benefit and bigger benefit, the plastic's still better than nothing. So I'm sort of cringing as I say that because I don't want to. I guess my response in that situation would be to think, what are the other biophilic elements that are more sustainable and better represent the concept of biophilic design that you could recommend? Because it is a real challenge there.
Well, what a great presentation. Thank you both very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Pascal and Jackie, please express your gratitude. Thank you again. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our long-time supporters, the Luminaries, for their continued support of green cities. For those of you who are Luminaries, and you can tell from the front of your badge, I gather, there's an afternoon tea now with Pascal in Mayfair Room 2, moderated by Narelle. Thank you, Narelle. So please see the staff in the foyer to direct you to that room. Just check again on the front of your name badge if you're in that distinguished category of long-term supporter. And before we head off for tea, we're going to play a short video from our major sponsor, Landcom, featuring Lauren Kajewski, Senior Manager, Sustainability and Housing Outcomes. Lauren's discussing energised communities, and please note that the next session starts sharp at 4:30. Sorry, 4:20. 4:20. Just tricking. 4:20.
At Landcom, we see an energised community as a place where people come together. They're out and about on the streets, they're using the places that we've created. So you've picked up your coffee from the Social Enterprise Cafe, you've walked your kids down to the park at the end of your street, and then you can let your dog off in the dog park that we've created. It's about people coming together and being proud of where they live. A great example we have at Landcom is the Social Corner at Green Square, where we've created a multi-use cafe so you can pick up a great coffee, set up your remote working hub, or come to a community event that we've put on for everyone. It's where people can connect. That's why energised communities are an integral part of our sustainability approach at Landcom.